Hello, everyone. I'm Joanne Bagshaw, and Tiffany Banks and myself would like to welcome you to the first Frank Islam Athenaeum Symposia event of the semester. Neil deGrasse Tyson has said, "The good thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe in it." And this quote is illustrated perfectly in today's talk, as we're going to hear a data-filled presentation on how America is changing and what America will look like in the future. And in just a moment, Dr. Rachel Sullivan will introduce our speaker, Paul Taylor. Before we get started, I have some practical information. For students who need a certificate of attendance, make sure that you grab one after the talk near the exit. For faculty and staff, there will also be certificates available for multicultural and diversity requirements. And for faculty only, please make sure that you sign in to get your professional development credit through Elite. Towards the end of the presentation, there will be time for questions and answers, and we'll invite you up to the microphone when it's time to do so. Additionally, there'll be a book signing outside of Globe Hall following the presentation. And lastly, at the end of the presentation, we'll have a book giveaway, so make sure that you stay until the end. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rachel Sullivan, who is a professor of sociology at Montgomery College and coordinator of the sociology discipline at Germantown. Her academic interests focus on race, ethnicity, and family. When she's not teaching Montgomery College students, she's chasing 3 elementary school children around her home. Please welcome Dr. Rachel Sullivan.
Thank you very much. It's nice to see all of you here. I would be remiss if I didn't start out by mentioning we were here at a very somber moment given the tragedy in Las Vegas last night. So I just wanted to sort of have a moment of silence for that. If we could acknowledge that, please, for a second. All right, thank you. I was very entertained by reading Dr. Taylor's book. As a sociologist, this mirrors very closely what I talk about in my classes, from the decline in marriage to the increase in the elderly population and our growing racial and ethnic diversity in this country. But I was not only interested in the book as a professor, but also as a mom and as someone whose family life is very closely mirrored by the discussion in the book. And so I thought it would be interesting for you all, not that you want to know everything about me, but I think it fits very well into this discussion. I have 2 parents who are 68-year-old baby boomers. They grew up in the Midwest. They married at a young age. They attended a high school where the diversity consisted of a German refugee family after World War II, 2 Jehovah's Witnesses, and a couple of kids who were Latino migrant farm worker children. No African Americans, and only the German family were immigrants, right? And that was the upbringing that they had. In spite of growing up in families of 4 and 7, my parents had 2 children, my brother and I, and we are the quintessential Gen Xers. We ironically do not have any millennials in our family because we are too old and my children are a little too young to be millennials. But I still think our family follows this. I'm part of this transitional Gen X generation. I grew up around a little bit more diversity than my parents. I married much later than them. I did have 3 kids. That was an anomaly. But the first time I had 2. And so this was part of this transition. Although I went to an all-white high school, I went to a very diverse college. And my exposure to immigrants, my exposure to people of color was much greater than theirs. And in fact, I married a Nigerian immigrant, and we have 3 biracial children, which is also another chapter in the book that talks about sort of this transition. My children live with me. I am now divorced. I'm a single mother. So they're growing up in a single mother home, which is another chapter in the book. I'm not exaggerating. Every chapter in the book fits with something that has happened in my family, and I think it's very relatable to talk about that. So my children attend a school where a very high percentage of the children are children of immigrants or immigrants themselves. Many of them don't speak English at home or speak English as a second language. Most of them are black and brown, and less than 20% are white. Think about how that compares to my parents, right? Or the German immigrants where the or the oddball children at the school. And here my children are with very few white kids in their school. In fact, less than 20%. So many of those kids are also near poverty. And that is reflected in the book as well, this discussion of how the younger generations are getting poorer and poorer. And my children also, I think, are reflected well in the book. They love iPads, and one of their aspirations is to be a YouTube superstar. They want to go viral. And they also taught their 65-year-old grandmother how to use her cell phone. One of them was 3 when he taught her how to use her cell phone. And so you see that the dramatic differences in the access to technology, our marital patterns, the racial makeup of our populations, and all of that is affected, or at least expressed, I should say, in my own family experience. And I would like for you all to reflect on that as Dr. Taylor speaks. Dr. Taylor is with the Pew Research Center, and his research is an excellent discussion about these changes that are occurring in our society, particularly as it pertains to the different generations and how they are experiencing them. And so without further ado, I will let him present his research, and I will stop talking about my family. Thank you.
She just gave my lecture. Just go ask any questions of her. She's lived it. She knows it. But I'm going to go ahead anyway. Thank you guys very much for having me. I am thrilled to be here because when I think about the next America and when I look out at this auditorium, I say, you are it. And frankly, you give me a lot of feelings of hope that we are going to be in good hands. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Demographic change is a drama in slow motion. It unfolds incrementally, it unfolds tick by tock, but it transforms societies in fundamental ways. And the America of the early 21st century is undergoing 2 of these dramas at the same time. We are en route to becoming a majority non-white country. At the same time, a record share of us, like me, and I am a 68-year-old boomer, are going gray. Either of these would be the dominant demographic story of its time. The fact that they're happening on top of each other has created generation gaps. We are at a moment in our history where young and old don't look alike, don't think alike, don't vote alike, don't use technology alike, don't form families alike, et cetera, et cetera. And this has the potential to put stress on everything from our politics, our workplaces, our family lives, our whole sense of social cohesion. Indeed, we have all gone through the last year and a half of a very divisive presidential campaign and now a very divisive first 10 months or so of the Trump presidency, and we all are living this change. We're in an era now of identity politics, where it's not so much my policies or my ideas against your policies and ideas. It's my tribe against your tribe. And broadly oversimplifying, we are now divided politically into one group that skews older and whiter, more conservative, more religious, more likely to live in small towns and rural areas, and another group that skews younger and browner and more liberal, more cosmopolitan, more likely to live in urban areas. And we're bumping up, and one group at the moment controls the politics and government. The other group, I think it's fair to say, controls the culture. There's plenty of grievance for both groups to have, and we're banging away at each other, and we go. It makes it worse that we go to our own news sites, and I find my truth on MSNBC, and you find your truth on Fox, or the other way around, and my news is real and your news is fake, and then we go to our social media sites, and we reinforce these louder echoes, these angry voices, reinforce our own sort of predispositions. Not a happy picture, and if this was the only picture of the America of the 21st century, what I would say is woe to us, woe to our children and grandchildren, and woe to our founding motto as a country, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. Happily, it is not the only picture, and I hope some of the data I'm going to show you will demonstrate that. The more interesting reality is that there are 2 opposite things happening at the same time. We are becoming more polarized, certainly politically, there's no getting around that, but we are also becoming more tolerant and more inclusive. I noticed that the unofficial college motto here is radical inclusion, and that represents something that's very real, and it's happening not just in places like this, but around the country. So both of these things are happening at the same time. The demographic change is certainly creating turbulence in the short run. My sense is, and I hope my data will demonstrate this, it has the potential to create enormous strength to us as a society in the long run. But we're on a slow walk to the long run, and it is pretty bumpy, and we're all living this. Okay. I'm going to start not with politics, but somebody smart said politics is downstream from culture. I want to start my presentation by going to what, certainly for somebody my age, is the epicenter of the American popular culture, which is the Super Bowl. We know football just this week and last is sort of in the middle of it's become a political football. I'm not going to get into that at the moment. But somebody my age, the Super Bowl gathers the biggest audience we assemble every year. And it's not only a platform for the biggest sporting extravaganza, it's a platform for the advertisers to reach the biggest audience we assemble every year. Somebody my age has been watching TV ads and TV ad families for more than a half a century. I know what the rules are, and the rules are that the parents in a TV ad family are supposed to be the same race and the opposite sex, and the language is supposed to be English. I want to show you very brief snippets of 3 ads from 3 of our most iconic brands that ran in the 2014 Super Bowl, and we are going to start with Chevrolet. Just a quick snippet.
Well, what it means to be a family hasn't changed. What a family looks like has. This is the new us.
Here's Cheerios.
You know how our family has daddy and mama?
And me.
Yeah, that's right. Pretty soon, you're going to have a baby brother.
She's not too happy about that. And here's Coca-Cola. Now, listen, product advertisers are not in the business of making political statements. They certainly don't want to make political enemies, not when each of them spent $4 million for 30 seconds in front of the biggest audience we assemble every year. And surely they knew, because they focus group these ads to a fairly well, that if they changed the rules, and if they showed families in which the parents were the same sex and the opposite race, and they sang America the Beautiful, as that ad did, in 6 different languages, they would offend a portion of their consumer base. And indeed, there was a reaction to all of those ads that appeared online. It appeared in some conservative precincts of the media. That interracial ad, the ad with the interracial couple, the white mother expecting another baby, when that was posted on YouTube, the comment screen got so ugly that they had to pull it down. Okay, let's fast forward 3 years later to this year's Super Bowl. In February of this year, at the end of this very turbulent campaign, a few weeks after the inauguration of Donald Trump, I'm going to show you even shorter snippets. This time, it's not just, as these ads did, wanting to identify their product with an America that is changing demographically. This battery of ads actually is affirmatively supporting diversity, gender equality, and immigration. And again, I think we're going to start Budweiser, Audi, Airbnb, and 84 Lumber very quick.
You don't look like you're from around here.
This is the beer we drink. What do I tell my daughter? Do I tell her that despite her education, her drive, she will automatically be valued as less than every man she ever meets?
One difference in those 3 years was that it now costs each of those advertisers $5 million to run those ads before the biggest audience we assemble. So what do they know? Knowing that there's a portion of their consumer base that doesn't like the sentiments and political sentiments expressed, what do they know? Here's what they know. This is a Census Bureau depiction of who we were racially and ethnically in 1965 and where we're headed by 2065. These may be off by a few percentage points, But to a large degree, they won't be off by much more than that. Demography is the future we already know. This is baked into birth rates, to death rates, to immigration rates. We're having, obviously, a political debate about size of immigration. But this is the journey that the country is on in this century. It is a journey very much driven by our modern immigration wave. We reopened our borders to immigrants in 1965, having closed them for much of the 20th century in reaction to earlier immigration waves. Big immigration waves always produce political, social, and economic reactions and backlashes. And by the 1920s, after a lot of European immigration, we'd had enough. We essentially closed our borders down to a trickle. Along comes a Great Depression, a World War, not much immigration. 1965, our middle class is expanding. The civil rights era is in full flight, and we open our borders back. And since then, in the 51, 52 years since then, 60 million immigrants have come to this country. Numerically, this is the largest immigrant wave in our history, a very brief history. Immigration to this country starts in earnest in the middle of the 19th century. Initially, it's from Northern and Western Europe, so the leading sending countries are Germany, Ireland. Towards the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, the immigration sending countries move south and east in Europe, so Italy, Poland, Russia become the leading sending countries. You add up all the immigrants, 9 in 10 of whom were white Europeans who came during that 80-year stretch, about 32 million came. In our 50-year stretch today, 60 million have come. Now, our population base was smaller back then, but numerically, the modern wave is the biggest in our history. Now, obviously, there's a difference in terms of where they're coming from, right? So in the modern wave, about half of all of our immigrants have come from Latin America, nearly 3 in 10 from Asia. If you just look at the last 15 years or so, what you see is that Asian immigration about 7 or 8 years ago surpassed Latin American immigration, and given the dynamics and the economics and the population base of the sending regions, that is likely to increasingly be a part of our future. Immigrants, the modern era immigrants may be coming from different parts of the world that our first waves of immigrants came from 100 and 150 years ago, but there are certain things about immigrants that don't change. Immigrants are strivers. Immigrants are optimists. Immigrants believe in the future. They believe that so much they uproot themselves to go to an alien place, an alien culture, to set down roots because they want a better life for themselves and in particular for their kids. One of the ways they give literal expression to this belief and wanting to build a better life is by having a lot of kids. Throughout all of human history, wherever immigrants arrive at, they tend to have about 50% more children than the native born of the country that receives them. So there's a phrase that demographers use called immigrant stock to describe the share of a population at any given time that's either immigrants or the children of immigrants. And you see here, back in 1960, about 1 in 5 of us were immigrant stock. If current trends continue, and again, we're having a debate, but they're not going to change all that much, a record 37% of us by the middle of this century, which isn't all that far off, will be immigrants or the children of immigrants. A pretty dramatic rise over a very short period of time. But if you go backwards in time, what you realize is that the outlier in our history was the late 20th century, when the story for a lot of people my age began, and many of us assume, well, that's the America that always was. No, the America that always was is a nation of immigrants. We are going forward to our past. If you add up all the immigrants who have come to the United States of America in our 240-year history, more than 100 million immigrants have come to the United States of America. There's no other country in the world in human history that has received more than 15 million immigrants. We are a nation of immigrants, always have been and are continuing to be. And in so many ways, here are a few factoids that illustrates one thing today's immigrants are doing and yesterday's immigrants have done. They are replenishing our economy. They are our current and they are our future workforce, and here's a way of expressing that. The share of our population, that last number, without, the number of whites in our workforce, because people like me are aging out of the workforce, the baby boom generation. So the workforce is going to be depleted of older whites. Well, you know what? Who are coming to replace them? It is younger non-whites. In addition to to filling the jobs. Immigrants throughout our history have always brought a sense of entrepreneurship. Immigrants are twice as likely as native-born to start small businesses. They are also, here is a really interesting list of the world's the world's top 5 publicly traded companies by market capitalization. And what do you notice about them? A, they're all part of the digital economy. They have figured out the digital economy. They've figured out how to monetize it. B, they're all American. Go USA. Okay. And there is a third thing. Let's take a look at the names associated with these companies. Steve Jobs is the son of a refugee from Syria. Mark Zuckerberg's wife is ethnic Chinese, parents refugees from Vietnam. Sergey Brin is an immigrant from Russia. Jeff Bezos is the son of a Cuban American. And Nadella is an immigrant from India. You think about the 2 companies that are transforming transportation in this country, which is likely to be one of the most revolutionary changes, self-driving cars and everything else. We have Tesla, an immigrant from South Africa. We have Uber, now led by an immigrant from Iran. We're lucky. We're lucky as a kind, always have been. Immigrants and the energy and the entrepreneurship they bring has always been the special sauce of America, and it is continuing to be. This wave, as I mentioned earlier, is doing something else. In addition to replenishing our economy, it is giving us literally a racial makeover. Let me go back for a second. So here again are our Census Bureau projections of what we will look like by race, black, white, Hispanic, Asian. But there's something else going on with our new weddings that raises a question as to whether these lines should really be as crisp as they appear to be, because our new weddings are creating a new America where racial boundaries are becoming more porous, and we really, I don't think we even yet have a vocabulary to describe that. If you go back to 1960, actually let's go back to 1961. 1961 is the year that Barack Obama's parents married and Barack Obama was born. And just so we won't start a political argument, let us stipulate that those events indeed happened in Hawaii and not in Kenya. Looking at census data, that year, 1961, something on the order of magnitude of 1 wedding in 1,000 in this country was like that one between a black person and a white person. That wedding was still illegal in 16 of our states, a gasp-inducing taboo everywhere else. And then all weddings that year across lines that we use of race and ethnicity to describe ourselves, about 2.5% were interracial or interethnic. And we fast forward to the present, and 17% of all weddings today are across lines of race and ethnicity. Indeed, one way to dramatize the two halves of more polarized and more tolerant is today interracial and interethnic marriages are about twice as common as bipartisan marriages. Only 9% of weddings today are between a Republican and a Democrat, double that number across lines of race and ethnicity. This is very much a creature of our new immigrant wave, and increasingly now the children of immigrants. Remember, it's a 50-year-old immigrant wave. Those immigrants have had kids. They have a lot of kids. Many of those kids are now perhaps in this audience. They're in the electorate. They're in the workforce. They're of marrying age, so more than roughly a quarter of our two leading immigrant groups, when they marry, quote, marry out, a non-Asian and non-Hispanic. About 2 in 10 blacks and about 1 in 10 whites marry across lines of race and ethnicity. Whites are still the largest single racial group in the country, so if you look at all of these marriages across these lines, about 70% of them have a white spouse. This raises simply a question. The Census Bureau has struggled with this since 1790. They change the definitions every year, and we as human beings struggle with this. What do we call each other? What do we call ourselves? What are we going to call the children of those marriages? What are they going to call themselves? And the answer is we don't really know yet. We're still trying to catch up with this and figure this out. I worked for many years at the Pew Research Center. We do a lot of public opinion survey research. So shortly after President Obama was elected, we asked the public this question. Do you think of him mainly as a black person, mainly as a mixed race person? And you see this kind of divided result. A slight majority of whites had a mixed race. Slight majority of blacks had them black. Significant minorities of each group had it the other way. We simply don't have a common vocabulary to describe this much more permeable and fluid boundaries of race. President Obama himself sometimes calls himself a mutt. He knows that mutts, that mixed-race people throughout human history in virtually all cultures have tended to have it bad. It's more often the case than not that they are rejected from the dominant bloodlines whence they came, and they're the odd one out. You know, here's a pretty good list of modern celebrities. You could come up with 10 other faces that would also be good. It's pretty good. They're all mutts. They're all mixed race. For some of them, being mixed race is part of their celebrity identity. For some of them, it's completely incidental. I don't want to sound like a Pollyanna. I don't want to suggest that all mixed race people lead these glamorous lives. Obviously, that's not the case. But I would say that who we quote elect to be our celebrities says something about our degree of tolerance and acceptance and inclusion. And this, it seemed to me, is part of the more positive statement about where we are. I don't want to end, however. Here's another way of looking at these changes where you see the oldest group in the country are whites, and the youngest group and the fastest growing group are the mixed race population, who are increasingly going to become who we are as Americans. I don't want to end with the suggestion that because these lines are being crossed in weddings and other places, we've solved all our problems on race. No, we haven't. And we know that, and we've lived that, and you guys have lived that in your young lives. And here's a kind of an interesting question where, starting in 2001, it's a Gallup survey where you ask the public, how often you worry a lot about race relations. Well, yeah, about a quarter of us did. Then it goes to a modern low right after Obama's elected. Just 13% of Americans said we worry a lot. And I know because I was doing a lot of surveys and focus groups of whites and blacks and others. The election of Obama really hit, was kind of a kumbaya moment, if you will, especially for the African American community, who many of whom said, certainly older African Americans, never saw this come, never would have guessed we would cross this threshold in my lifetimes. Obama himself has said he feels like he came along about 20 years after his demographically, designated time. He kind of beat the clock, if you will. So there was this feeling, my God, we've solved the riddle. Look what we've done. And look what's happened in the 8 years since. And we know the history. There's been a lot of police shootings. There's a lot of rubbing raw. And in some ways, it began during the Obama era. It seemed like it's gotten a lot worse just in the last 10 months. And I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on the politics of this. It's just simply to leave you with the notion, this is our original sin in this country. We've been trying to figure it out for 240 years. We've still got a lot of work to do. But as I'll show you a little bit later, your generation brings a set of values toward some of these challenges that I think leaves us in pretty good hands. Okay, I want to move to the other half of the demographic equation, getting older. I regret to say a lot of that is going on. I'm looking around. You guys are doing all right. I see a few gray hairs out there. So, yeah, it's happening, guys. It's happening. I want to show you what demographers call an age pyramid. Every horizontal bar represents a 5-year slice of the population. So our 0 to 4s are at the bottom. Our 85 and overs are at the top. Throughout all of human history, whenever you would slice and dice a population this way with these horizontal bars, you always got a pyramid. This is what our pyramid looked like in 1960. Let's go back in time 100 years. You see it's still a pyramid. The angles are much sharper. There are fewer people living to middle and old age. 1900, the lines are changing a little bit. Now we're back to 1960. Let's take a look at what happens to our pyramid over the next 100 years. And we basically have ourselves a rectangle, and this is uncharted waters in human history. You can bring our rectangle to a point. You just have to add a few more bars up top. The Census Bureau says that by the middle of this century, there'll be about 500,000 Americans who are age 100 or older. In other words, a big enough population of the old that you can start to depict them on a chart like this. There's a lot to like about this change. It is driven by two related demographic dramas that are very profound. Life expectancy is going up, and birth rates are coming down. So people are living longer, they're having fewer kids. That takes your pyramid and turns it into a rectangle. And again, if you like human life, what's not to like about living longer? And if you worry about the sustainability of the Earth's resources, the fact that birth rates have come down, not just in this country. These lines are moving in the same direction all over the world, happening at different rates in some parts of the world than others, but all over the world. In terms of birth rates, if you went back another 100 years in this country, it would be 5 or 6 children for the typical woman. If you look just to our south in Mexico, or halfway around the world in Iran, two very different countries, just in the last 50 years, we've gone from 6 children per woman to 2 children per woman. Indeed, in terms of some of these issues around immigration, and particularly illegal immigration, where Mexico has been the biggest source, immigration from Mexico has essentially stopped, or net immigration has stopped. There's always some flow back and forth. But net immigration from Mexico, both legal and illegal, has been net zero for the last 8 or 10 years. Some of that had to do with the recession we had in this country where the jobs dried up, but most of it had to do with the fact that 20 or 30 years ago, Mexican women stopped having so many babies, and there are fewer young, now teenagers, looking for work. So all of these things are sort of interrelated. But while there's a lot to like about longer lifespans and lower birth rates, there are some challenges too. The baby boom generation, which has been demographically disruptive, my generation, you saw as those fertility rates came down, there was that big bulge in the middle, very unusual event. That was the baby boom. That began right after World War II, 1945, 1946. The GIs came home from the war. We won the war, pent-up energy, let's go make babies, and they made a lot of babies. And this stayed that way for 18 or 20 years. So it's not surprising there was such a dramatic historical event that you saw the rates shoot up. Equally surprising how dramatically they came down, and that was when the birth control pill for the first time came on the market in the mid-1960s. Baby boomers have been a disruptive generation demographically at every point along the way. Most of you are too young to... You could argue they built the suburbs for us. They built the interstate highway system for us. We had to build all these extra classrooms on our schools because there were so many of us. For most of the last 20, 30, 40 years, we've been in the workforce, but now we're getting a little old. And today, 10,000 baby boomers will turn 65 and leave the workforce and go into retirement. Tomorrow, another 10,000 baby boomers will turn 65, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. This happens every single day between now and the year 2030. And as this giant pig in a python generation migrates out of the workforce into retirement, it will put stress on the biggest, the most expensive, and the most, I would argue, the most important domestic program we have, which is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Between those three programs, that's close to 2/3 of our federal budget. And I'm not going to get into a long lecture on this, but just a couple of salient facts. These programs depend, it's today's taxpayers pay into these programs to support today's retirees. So the whole ball game in terms of keeping these financially afloat is the relationship between the number of taxpayers bipartisan. They issue a report every year to the president, the Congress, the American public, and they say, hey guys, these are going bankrupt. We won't be able to pay full benefits within about 15 years or so. The longer you wait, the deeper the hole, the more the burden falls on your generation. Let's do something now. Because the choices are hard and because our political system these days is pretty damn dysfunctional, we don't do anything. Millennials, your generation, the 18 to 35-year-olds, know this. They may not know the details of it, but when you ask, as we did at Pew Research, your generation, do you expect to get these benefits when you retire? and we gave people three choices. Yes, not at all. Half said, I don't think I'm going to get these programs at all. 40% said yes, but at reduced levels. Just 6% said, I expect that when I retire, these will be here for me at current rates, which is pretty astonishing. And then if you add another finding, when you ask a I'm in 10 millennials saying yes, they are good for America. Now we live in a very kind of negative age about all things having to do with government or almost anything else. We joke around the office. Those was called back then, you're putting in your tax money and you're taking back out when you retire. That's actually not exactly the way it worked, but it is added to the political popularity. The other thing most young adults your age know is because of these programs, Grandma and Grandpa are doing okay. They may not be living on easy street, but they have done what they were designed to do, which is put a floor of an economic foundation, a floor of economic dignity. And if Grandma and Grandpa are okay, that works its way down to Mom and Dad and their grandchildren as well. So we like these programs a lot. They just need to be modernized. One of the biggest political challenges we have. Let's talk briefly about our four generations, and I want to end with. Okay. Am I not going to? Okay. So here are our four generations very quickly, and I want to focus particularly on millennials. Our oldest generation, so-called silent generation, they're now in their 70s and above. They are actually our most financially secure generation. Again, they're not all doing great, but in Roosevelt's day, for most of our history, older adults were the poorest age cohort in the country. Today, they are the least likely to be poor. But the official Census Bureau says of 65 and overs, just 9% of them are poor. Without Social Security and Medicare, nearly 50% of them are poor. So it's been enormously important to provide that floor. They had a pretty good run in terms of their economic lives. Their work lives were in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The middle class was expanding. You still had old-fashioned pensions. So they had a lot of things going right for them economically. On the other hand, they look at some of the cultural changes and some of the racial changes and some of the ads that they see when they tune into the Super Bowl, and a lot of them feel like strangers in their own country. I didn't get this memo. This is not the America that I was born into. That's not my understanding of who America is. And then you throw in the speed of technological change, and they're sort of dizzy and having trouble coping. Talked a little bit about the baby boomers. Very important until the millennial generation, the largest in our country's history. Some of you are old enough to remember, the baby boom generation comes of age in the 60s, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, counterculture, civil rights, women's rights, leading a lot of people to think it's a very liberal generation. In fact, it's always politically been a mixed generation. My generation has been old enough to vote in 12 presidential elections, and only one of those 12 presidential elections has a majority of baby boomers voted for the Democrats. So we've always, the same generation that protested the Vietnam War, fought in the Vietnam War, and we've always had these sort of political and cultural differences within our generation. Next down are the Gen Xers. We heard a little bit from one, and then they tend to get a little bit slighted by people like me, in part because they're simply numerically a smaller generation. There was more of a baby bust, But one of the things that's interesting, today, boy, that doesn't want to stay on here. Today, you hear about helicopter parents. You talk about today's millennials raised in a very child-centric world. You're very precious. Everybody gets a trophy. You're very special. 30 years ago, as Gen Xers were going through childhood, you heard the expression helicopter parent, which is, as they were born at a time when divorce rates were spiking, the traditional nuclear family was under stress, I'm sorry, latchkey children was the expression. You're on your own, kid. Figure it out for yourself. Go home. The house will be empty. Lock the door behind you. Have a healthy snack. Do your homework. I'll be home at 5. This describes the juggling that goes on in nuclear families as these changes come along. I think I'm oversimplifying and stereotyping dramatically. Obviously, this doesn't describe every young adult or child experience in every generation, but there is enough data, demographic and attitudinal, to support these generalizations. And finally, the millennials, your generation, which we define as sort of 18 to 35-year-olds, fascinating generation. You're already the biggest, 80 million strong, and you're now aging into the electorate, the workforce. And you are carrying a set of values that will define who America is for much of the remainder of this century. So let's look a little bit about some distinctive traits of the millennials. And we're going to start here with two, what somebody my age would describe as anchor institutions in any society, politics and religion. And we're looking at trend lines over the last 7-8 years of our 4 generations. The millennials are the black line. Over on the left, we have never seen a generation more allergic to a political party label. Half of millennials describe themselves as independent. What's particularly interesting is we know how they vote from Election Day exit polls. Millennials are a very big D Democratic, very liberal voting generation. They simply don't like the label. They don't feel a sense of affiliation with a political party. Over to the right, you see similarly with religion. The United States throughout its history has been the most religious advanced economy in the world. That remains so the case, but we are becoming less religiously affiliated year after year, and this is a trend very much driven by the millennial generation. And then there's another institution to which millennials are not affiliating, at least not yet, and that one has been around for 5,000 years, called marriage. So we're looking at the share of millennials who were married versus these older generations back when they were 18 to 35. And you see the rates are down by, in the case of between them and their grandparents' generation, are down by more than half. This is a dramatic change. Talk about loss of market share. Marriage has been around for thousands of years. If you took a snapshot of all adults in this country age 18 and over 50 years ago, at any given moment in time, 72% of them today, 50%. An extraordinary change, and very, very much, again, led by this generation of young adults. So what's going on here? There's one theory that it's all about this. Some of you may know a book came out last year, Aziz Ansari, the modern romance, who said, if anybody is holding one of these in his or her palm, and of course we all hold these in our palm, you've got a 24/7 singles bar right at your disposal, and you can go on it and you can swipe right, and you can find somebody who's smarter, prettier, funnier, sexier than whoever you happen to be going out with at the time. And better yet, he or she may be just at the far end of the bar that you're drinking at right now. Now, so that this leads to a commitment phobia. How can I commit to anybody when there's so much out there and I can find it? I don't think that's right. I mean, that I'm sure that comports with perhaps some aspect of human experience, and I'm not speaking of somebody who lives in this world. The other side of this equation is eHarmony. You know, these dating sites have been around for 20 years now, and when they started, they were the outposts of sort of the desperate and the weird. They are today totally mainstream, and eHarmony claims that of all recent weddings, about 1/3 of them are the result of relationships that began here, because as it does with shopping and all sorts of other things, this is just a way to perfect the marketplace and expand the marketplace. So I don't think technology is the explanation for this. Here's what I think, in fact, I know is the explanation for this, because we survey young adults who are in their 20s who are not married, and we ask them, what's the deal? Do you want to get married? The majority say yes, although somewhat smaller majorities than would have been the case in earlier generations of the same age. What's holding you back, we ask, and we give them all sorts of possibilities. And bottom line is, it's the economics. Me, get married, I don't have the economic foundation. I don't have a good job. I don't have a career path. I'm not sure yet, and I'm just not ready. And in this, they are describing a very important new reality of economic life in America. So here we are looking at the median net wealth, everything you own minus everything you owe, of households headed by, on the left, somebody under 35 versus on the right, somebody 65 and over. That's about an 8-to-1 gap. Not surprising that there should be a gap. People tend to accumulate wealth as they age. That, however, was the gap in 1983. Let's fast forward to the present. The exact same methodology. This is Federal Reserve Board data, apples to apples. We correct for inflation and everything else. And the gap is now 20-to-1. So today's older adults are doing significantly better than yesterday's older adults, and today's younger adults are doing significantly worse than yesterday's younger adults, and the gap has gotten much, much larger. So it's one of the reasons why young adults your age are what somebody my age would say are on a slow walk to adulthood. You're not getting married, not buying houses, not buying cars, et cetera, and you can track all of these things in the economic data. Not getting married, however, children are still happening. So today, 40% of all children in this country are born to a single mother. 50 years ago, 5% of all children were born to a single mother. Now, you don't need to be a sociologist to know that single parenting is a challenge. Just juggling it, it is associated with high rates of poverty, just the stress of keeping it all together. And if you told somebody my age 50 years ago, we're heading for an America where 40% of all kids are born to single mothers, I would have said then is down that path lies a lot of really unfortunate outcomes for kids. Let me show you, however, some contrary data. Here is a 25-year or so trend line starting in the mid-1990s about kids getting arrested. It's down. It's actually down a little bit more than that because I haven't updated the last couple of years. Here's a trend line in the high school dropout rates. It's gotten much, much better. Kids are doing a much better job of getting through high school. Births to teenage girls over the last 25 years is down. Significantly down. It's now 60%. Smoking is down. Drinking is down. This generation of young adults is trying to play by the rules, and their behaviors are suggesting that. And their behaviors are suggesting that despite the challenging economic and family circumstances, there is some resilience in the human spirit that wants to do the right thing. This may be one explanation for that, which is the dramatic increase in the number of multi-generational family households, by which we mean at least two adult generations living under the same roof, and often a generation of children as well. So today, 61 million Americans, about 18% of our population, lives in households like this. That's double the number who lived in such households a few decades ago. Some of this is the growing number of immigrants. Immigrants often come without that many resources. It's all about saving for the future, and one way to do that is to double and triple up. But most of this is the 20-somethings who aren't married, who are having trouble getting started, don't have that good first job. And if you're in that circumstance, mom and dad's house ain't a bad place to hang out on. The refrigerator is usually stocked. You don't have to put coins in the washing machine. And now about 32% of millennials are still living with their parents. Again, this is in Europe, this number, which has some of the exact same cultural changes around marriage and economic changes for young adults, this figure is closer to 50%. When Pope Francis was here 2 years ago, one of the things he did in Philadelphia was a big forum on family life, where it was literally like a town hall, and it was on the mall in Philadelphia. People could come up and ask him a question, and one woman screwed up her courage and said, "Holy Father, help me out. I have a 35-year-old son. He's single. He's still living with us. What should I do?" And the Pope said, "Stop ironing his shirts." We expected to find, and he living as he now does in Italy, knows this phenomenon well. In Italy and Southern Europe, the culture of the young man living with his mother is sort of ingrained. Bamboccione, big baby, or mamismo, mama's boy. It has never been that much a part of the culture here, but it's becoming more so. And what we found in these families is the parents actually get along, and the kids actually get along pretty well. for somebody my age, if your millennial age child comes back in, you got instant IT support. You finally have somebody who explains to you, which remote control devices go to which gadget, and that's a huge help. These kids actually like their parents, admire their parents' values. So there's a lot to like about this. But because they aren't buying cars, they aren't buying houses, here's an amusing collection of trade association headlines about millennials. What's wrong with them? They're killing this industry, they're killing that industry, have their tastes changed, they're not shopping anymore, they get everything online. The answer is, part of it is technological change, part of it is they just don't have a lot of money. And here is some data that show that when we ask our 4 generations 2 questions. You currently have enough money to lead the life you want? That's the dark green. Not surprisingly, fewer millennials say yes to that question than any other age group. You expect to eventually have enough money to lead the life you want. That's the light green, and millennials are our leading optimists. So, what is going on here? Are you guys young and stupid? And the answer is yes, but but that's because that comes with the age. You're supposed to be young and stupid. You're supposed to feel in your 20s that you're invincible and you can figure it all out, and God bless you for that. I think on top of that natural life cycle aspect, there is this. This is the most important change, certainly in my lifetime, the digital revolution. To me, as a boomer, I'm always adapting to it and adjusting to it, and I'm always sort of 2 steps behind. I'm astonished. I spent 25 years as a newspaper reporter trying to get information and having gotten it then transmitted from some faraway places, including Africa, for a lot of years. The idea that I hold something in my hand and I literally, with 2 or 3 clicks, can access, I exaggerate only slightly, I can access the sum of all human knowledge. And frankly, these days, if it takes me the 3rd click, I'm thinking, what the hell is taking so long, right? But at least at some level, it is astonishing. It is not astonishing for your generation because it is the world, it's the only world you've known. And it is not only your indispensable platform for information acquisition, it has become your indispensable platform for social interaction. So one of the reasons that those anchor institutions of, to me, politics, religion, don't attract your generation the way they attracted mine is you guys create your own social universe here. Somebody more clever than me described your generation as a pre-Copernican generation. Online, the universe really can and does revolve around you. And you can place yourself at the center of it, and you can create a circle of friends, and you can put up your little video of your cat playing the piano, and maybe if it's cute, maybe 5 or 10 of your friends will look at it. But if that cat does a nice job, maybe 100, maybe 1,000, maybe 1,000,000, it has the potential to go viral. There's no other human beings in history that have at least the potential to reach that kind of audience and to be at the center of it. So there is a sense of empowerment and optimism that I think comes with that I hope serves you well. There may be some unpleasant reckonings. One of the things, of course, that it has created is a world of selfie taking. And these data are a couple of years old now, but really what I want to describe is the differences in the generations on that. So a lot of older adults look at you guys and see all you ever seem to do is take pictures of yourself, and you say, "Come on already! What kind of narcissist are you?" Now, no boomer has any right to call any other generation narcissists. We're pretty good at that at ourselves, even without this. But if you can tell your own story, and if you have your own built-in audience, it is enormously empowering. So today, what is it? The typical kid spends 50 hours a week with his nose or her nose buried in front of these screens. And again, the older adults say, there's a world out there. Well, for you guys, that is your world. And so this is what a group activity looks like, and this is what modern romance looks like. And this is what the day at the beach looks like. So we need people my age need to get over it. Okay, there are some. There are some perhaps unfortunate consequences of this, and here's one: social trust, very important ingredient in any society. And this is a response to a basic question: would you say most people can be trusted, or you can't be too careful dealing with other people? Here are 4 generations' responses to this question in the last 25 years. The millennials have been asking for the last 10 years. They are the least trusting generation of other human beings that we have ever seen. Now, this is not a good thing. We live in a fast-paced entrepreneurial society. Trust is the grease that keeps the gears from grinding. Trust is what enables you to do a business deal with somebody who is not from your neighborhood, your tribe, etc. So what is going on here? Well, a couple of quick theories. If virtually all your important social interactions happen here, it takes you about a nanosecond to figure out that online not everybody who's who they say they are. Some of it, I think, has to do with the very protective parenting norms. We had that horror yesterday in Las Vegas. If you think in the lives of millennial going back to Columbine 15 or 20 years ago, all the way through to all these shootings and everything else, the message. I lived in an age of big terror where when I was a school kid, we ducked under desks because we worried that a nuclear bomb would come out of the sky. You guys live in a world of more intimate terrors where maybe that kid who lives around the block who, is going to come in and shoot up. And there's a wariness that I think that comes with that. But most importantly, and this we know from sociology, groups that feel vulnerable in a society for whatever reason, whether they're racial minorities, whether they're at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale, tend to be less trusting because they're less well fortified to deal with the consequences of misplaced trust. So this is a feature of your generation that I think as you grow into full adulthood is something to keep in mind. Very quickly, a few other differences that make the point that while the millennial generation is on its back foot economically, it is on its front foot in terms of setting the new cultural norms in this country. So again, to go back to some of the themes that I showed in those ads, millennials are much more comfortable with interracial marriage. Same-sex marriage, a dramatic change. You go back 15 years in this country on the left, the whole population about 2 to 1 against same-sex marriage. Today we're nearly 2 to 1 in support of same-sex marriage. And if you look at the generational components over to the right of those changes, you see every generation has become more supportive, with millennials very much leading the way. You see something almost identical. This is a 25-year trend on immigration. So you go back to in the mid-1990s, and the simple question here is, do immigrants strengthen or burden our country? 20, 25 years ago, 2 to 1, they are a burden to our country. Today, despite the very difficult anti-immigrant rhetoric that we've all been living and listening to over the last year or two, it's gone the other way. We're almost 2 to 1 with the notion, yes, immigrants strengthen our country. And again, you look at the generational components, and you see again, it is the millennials who are calling the tune, and it is the older generation that is having to catch up with the values. This has led to a young-old voting gap throughout the 80s, 90s, and early aughts. Young and old in this country didn't vote very different. They almost voted identically. Starting in the mid-aughts, the 2 Obama elections, this last election, you see this gap opening up. At the same time, you see a Congress and our elected leaders in Washington who have been sent here by this more polarized public, and they don't get much done. And confidence in government. Look what's happened in the last 50 or 60 years. Again, I came of age in the 60s, which were remembered as a turbulent time, culturally a turbulent time. Even then, about 3/4 of the public said, yeah, I basically trust the government to do what's right. It has been straight downhill with one little interruption, which was the rally round the flag right after 9/11. But John McCain now says, if you look at confidence in Congress, it's down to single digits. John McCain says we're down to paid staff and blood relatives. This is not a happy situation. Here is one thing that's driving that. It's a complicated chart. We're going back 100 years here, and it has to do with rising income inequality. If you go back to the Gilded Age, 100 years or so or more, we got up to nearly 50% of the national income was taken in by the top 10% of the population. Then along comes the Great Crash, along comes a depression, World War II, expanding middle class. That goes way down. The middle class is expanding through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. So one of the reasons we opened our doors to more immigrants. But the digital world, has been a kind of winner-take-all world. And the rich have gotten richer, and now they're back up. The latest numbers out last week from the Census Bureau. The top 10% is now taking in more than 50% of the income. That means the bottom 90% has less than 50%, and they are living more difficult lives economically. One of the things about the American dream is, one of the reasons we've been a magnet for immigrants for 200 plus years is it always gets better. The whole idea of America is your kids are going to do better than you. That's the American dream. Well, today you ask the American public that question, and by 2 to 1, it's very unusual. By 2 to 1, Americans say, no, I don't think today's children are going to do better than us. This is contrary to what we think about ourselves as a society of ever upward mobility. You look at all the other countries, the leading countries of Western Europe and the leading economic powers of the world, and they are all struggling with this same sense that we're on the downside of the mountain here, that economic opportunity for the next generation is not what it once was. Contrast that with the largest country in Africa and the largest country in the world, dramatically different. So, listen, per capita income, this country versus Nigeria, I think it's 12 or 15 to 1. And this country versus China, it's 5 or 7 to 1. This is not about where we are today. This is about where we think we are going tomorrow. And in terms of some of the ugliness of our political rhetoric and some of the divisiveness, I think it is driven by this sense that we're no longer on the up escalator. Here's another way of describing that. If you were born in the 1940s, as I was, and you age through your life cycle, 90% of the people born in my era ultimately over the course of their lives did better than their parents. And then you go straight down and you look at young adults born in the 1980s, as I assume some of you were, and only 50% are on path to do better than your parents. And you live it, you feel it, and it does enforce this sense that America isn't fulfilling its promise. 2 last slides on a more optimistic note. This goes back to this sense of diversity. And here's a question we ask, the Pew Research asks in America and around the world. Does our diversity, people from all over the world, changing, does it make us a better or a worse place to live? 58% of Americans said it made us a better place to live. Just 7% say it makes us a worse place to live. Now, the others say, not sure, don't want to answer. And some of that may be unwillingness, may be political correctness and everything else, unwillingness to acknowledge the fact that you're uncomfortable with diversity. You look at all of the large countries in Europe, the response to this question, and it is in a very different place. Warts and all, troubles and all, we have the chance to embrace this diversity and carry it forward and build a stronger America. In part because your generation, which has the values that are most likely to do so, really will be running the show. Today, in 2014, millennials surpassed the boomers as the largest generation in the country. Here's the share going forward. Millennials will continue to be at 80 million strong, the biggest generation for the next 20 or 30 years. Fellow baby boomers, any of you are out there, it's all downhill. And finally, we ask the American public 2 questions about diversity. Do you think it'll make it hard for us to find consensus, or do you think these generation and diversity gaps can be a source of strength as long as we recognize our interdependence? And at least expressing an aspiration, 2/3 of the country, of all generations and across all races, say, yeah, it can be a source of strength. We've had a lot of talk in this political season about making America great again. My favorite aphorism on that subject is an old proverb that says, societies become great when old men plant trees whose shade they know they will never sit under. For 200 plus years, the United States has been a nation of planters. Intercontinental Railroad, interstate highway system, internet, Erie Canal, Hoover Dam, land-grant colleges, GI Bill. We have always understood that you pay it forward. You build for future generations. We are, in the current moment, in our political divisiveness, doing less of that, and we are leaving your generation with $20 trillion in debt that will be a burden. $20 trillion in debt that you will be spending your lifetime paying taxes to pay off. A Social Security and Medicare system that is not on a sustainable funding basis. Declining investments in education, infrastructure, and all the rest. So what I would say to my generation is, while we still have enough spring in our step, let's change course, let's try to change policies and do what Americans have always done. And what I would say to your generation is get involved. these policies, I think at the level of human interaction, I would happily put my faith in your generation because I think you have the right values. But in terms of public policies, we got a lot of work to be done, and get involved and build a better life for yourselves and your fellow millennials. And thank you for listening. I've gone overboard on time. There are a few microphones. If anyone has a burning question to ask, I'd be happy to answer. I'd be happy also to talk to people informally. I gather there are some books that can be given away up there, so I can chat with you there. But anybody have a question that everybody should hear? Can you go to a microphone?
Hello, everybody. My name is Eugene. I'm a student at Montgomery College. And my question to you is, what about Native Americans?
Great
I didn't
question.
hear anything about them throughout the conversation.
I don't include them. One of the reasons was they're a very small population, and in most of the surveys we do at Pew Research, we're not able to get to them. There are logistical difficulties in terms of doing surveys.
So you're excluding them from this country at all?
No, I'm not. I mean...
Because you've talked about immigrants, you've talked about different generations, but you never mentioned anything about...
Yeah, the point is well taken, and well, I mean, I think most people know the history, and it is not a happy history of Native Americans. It hasn't been for hundreds and hundreds of years. But most of my presentation is data-based, and I simply don't have as good a data set on attitudes of Native Americans, so that's the reason for their not being included. I don't need to not suggest that they're not important. They are the original Americans, no question about it.
They're not original Americans?
No, they are the original Americans.
Oh, they are?
Yeah.
But their opinion is not there, since you
Point taken.
Study their opinion.
Anybody else?
Thank you.
So I've been having this debate. What are we calling the generation that's coming up now? So what are my children and you know under 18?
Well, I will give you my candidate. Generation. First of all, there's nothing official about generations. They are more constructs of the culture than they are of the Census Bureau or anything else. But generations are thought to last about 20 years. The oldest millennial is in his or her mid-30s, so presumably we're down to the mid-teens, and today's children and young teenagers are somebody different. They're not old enough, I think, to have exhibited a set of behaviors or values that you can test to sort of know what they think and how they behave yet. But there is something we do know about them already. They are our first majority non-white generation. And my candidate for a name is the Mosaics, which I think reflect not only reflect their diversity, but reflect an attitude toward diversity that I think is very different from melting pot, which was the metaphor we used in the 20th century to describe you come from all over, and over the course of a few generations you melt into one, and that's how America works. Well, these children have come from all over. They're not, in part because they bring different racial characteristics, they're not going to melt, nor do they particularly care to melt. Maybe some of them do, but many of them really want to retain their individual identities, and they're in a culture that's much more accepting of that. So I think Mosaic gets the best of both worlds. Let's celebrate our diversity, but together a mosaic can build a beautiful whole. On that happy note, I think I will let you all go. You've been a very attentive audience, and I'd be happy to take any more questions.